8 months. That is all the time Washington has given itself to end 65 years of communist rule in Cuba. Not a negotiation, not a request, a deadline. And the terrifying part is not whether Cuba meets it. The terrifying part is what happens the morning after it expires, because nobody in Washington has answered that question yet. Stay with me, because the answer changes everything you think you know about this standoff. In mid-March, the Trump administration delivered a private message to Havana. Diaz-Canel had to go. The New York Times confirmed the administration was actively pursuing his removal during closed-door negotiations. Then, the senior American diplomat in Cuba, Mike Hammer, did something extraordinary. He went to a Spanish newspaper, not an American one, and said on the record that there are people inside Cuba's regime who know the project is ending and may be ready to make a move. Read that again. The top U.S. diplomat in Havana used a foreign press outlet to broadcast an open invitation to every ambitious general and party official on the island who is quietly calculating whether loyalty to Diaz-Canel is still worth the risk. That is not quiet diplomacy. That is a public audition for a coup. If that detail didn't stop you, the next one will. Diaz-Canel sat down with NBC News on April 10th, his first interview with an American broadcaster, and delivered his answer in 4 words. "Stepping down is not part of our vocabulary," he said. Then, 4 days later, Trump referenced Cuba during remarks about Iran and said, quote, "We might stop in Cuba after we're done with this. Not off the cuff, not a joke." Said directly to reporters on the record. Then came the deadline. A prominent Cuban exile leader who met with U.S. officials directly told the press the decision has been made. Cuba must be free before the end of 2026, 8 months, to end 65 years. Here is where the story cracks open. The Trump administration is not calling for democratic elections. It is not demanding multi-party governance. It is asking one man to leave while keeping the system that produced him completely intact. And Diaz-Canel knows exactly what that means. He told NBC he is open to dialogue without pressure or preconditions, but Washington's entire approach is built on pressure and preconditions, the main one being his resignation. You cannot call that a negotiation. That is theater engineered to produce a refusal that justifies escalation. But here is the part that most coverage has completely missed, and it is the piece that makes this entire strategy dangerously fragile. Washington believes there are pragmatists inside Cuba's government who will trade Diaz-Canel's head for their own survival. That is what Hammer was signaling. But pragmatists inside authoritarian systems do not move first. They wait. They watch who else moves. They calculate whether the Americans are serious or whether they will lose interest after the next news cycle. And they know something Washington may be dangerously underestimating. The Cuban security apparatus monitors every conversation, every meeting, every phone call. Moving against Diaz-Canel is not a career decision. It is a survival decision. And right now, the survival math still favors loyalty, because the man 90 miles away making speeches through foreign newspapers has not yet made himself more frightening than the man who controls the prisons. Keep watching, because the economic numbers that come next reframe this entire crisis in a way nobody is talking about. The economic collapse in Cuba is not background noise. It is the main event. Blackouts are routine. Hospitals lack basic medicine. Schools are closing. Monthly rice allocations have been cut. In 2022 and 2023 alone, more than 500,000 Cubans left the island, out of a population of 11 million. That is not migration. That is hemorrhage. The people leaving are young, educated, and productive. They are precisely the ones Cuba cannot afford to lose. Venezuela, Cuba's primary economic patron for 20 years, is itself in crisis and can no longer deliver subsidized oil. Tourism revenue collapsed and never recovered. Hard currency reserves have dropped to levels that cover weeks of critical imports, not months. Washington's message to Havana's leadership is blunt. Negotiate your exit now with some dignity, or wait for total economic collapse and lose everything. That is not a negotiation. That is two doors that lead to the same room. And yet Diaz-Canel's refusal is not irrational. Cuba's communist government has survived 11 American presidents. It outlasted the Soviet Union. It endured the special period when GDP contracted 35%. It survived the Bay of Pigs, the missile crisis, and 6 decades of embargo. The regime's resilience runs on 2 engines: ideology and repression. For a leader raised inside the Castro tradition, resigning under American pressure would not just be political defeat, it would be the destruction of the mythology the party has built for 65 years. The cost of leaving is the end of the story Cuba has told itself for generations. Diaz-Canel understands that a leader who surrenders the narrative surrenders everything. Russia pledged Cuba would never be abandoned. Chinese officials called the American demand a violation of international law, but Soviet-era language without Soviet-era resources is not rescue. It is rhetoric, and Cuba is still rationing rice. Here is what is actually happening, and it is darker than either side's public narrative. The deadline is not a plan, it is a pressure instrument. Setting end of 2026 as the target does 3 things at once. It signals seriousness to the Cuban exile community in Miami, a critical Republican voting bloc. It tells insiders inside the regime that their window to cut a deal is shrinking, and it tells Diaz-Canel the pressure will only intensify. But a deadline without an enforcement mechanism is a bluff. And a bluff that gets called does not just fail, it becomes a lesson. Every authoritarian government watching this, and they are all watching, learns the same thing. Set your teeth. Absorb the pain. Wait for the clock to expire. American deadlines end. American attention shifts. If you survive the countdown, you survive everything. There are 3 possible endings to this story, and none of them are clean. The best case for Washington is that something fractures inside the regime. A general moves. A faction negotiates behind Diaz-Canel's back. But even in that scenario, what follows is not democracy. What follows is a military-backed government that cooperates with American interests in exchange for sanctions relief. The generals who control Cuba's tourism, telecommunications, and trade infrastructure do not disappear when the president does. They inherit his power. A Cuban junta aligned with Washington is a fundamentally different outcome from the free Cuba the administration is promising. The second outcome is that nothing breaks. Diaz-Canel holds. The party holds. The apparatus holds. The population suffers, but does not revolt in numbers that threaten the regime. The deadline passes. Cuba is still communist. And the damage extends far beyond the island because now every authoritarian government on earth has proof that American ultimatums can be outlasted. Then there is a third possibility, the Vietnam model. Diaz-Canel resigns. The Communist Party installs someone younger and more pragmatic, offers just enough reform to release the pressure, and keeps the system completely intact. One-party rule survived in Vietnam because the party adapted. It changed the face. It kept the structure. Washington declared progress. The structure continued. Here is what we know for certain. Trump asked Cuba's president to resign. Diaz-Canel refused publicly and on the record. The administration has set an unofficial deadline of December 2026. Cuba's economy is in free fall, with 500,000 people fleeing in 2 years. American diplomats are openly courting regime insiders through foreign newspapers. Russia and China have offered words, but not resources. The administration has not explained what happens if the deadline passes, and that silence is the loudest thing in this entire story. There is a difference between setting a deadline and having a plan for what comes after it. Washington has spent months perfecting the pressure. The plan for the morning after remains empty. 8 months is long enough to apply pressure, long enough to manufacture a crisis. But it is not long enough to build what has to come next. And a deadline without a destination is just a clock counting down to the moment when everyone in the room realizes no one knows what they were counting toward. The most dangerous part of this strategy is not what happens before December 2026. It is what happens on January 1st, 2027, when the answer can no longer be postponed. Now here is my question for you, and I want you to take it seriously. Has an American ultimatum ever successfully forced regime change through economic pressure alone, without military intervention? Name the examples. Make the argument, because the pattern this administration is following has a historical record, and that record is complicated. Drop your answer below. We cover this story daily, and the comments on this topic have consistently surfaced analysis that mainstream coverage has not. If you are tracking this story to its conclusion, subscribe, because this one has an expiration date, and we will be here for every day of the 8 months that remain.